Well, welcome to 4SA's weekly interview update. We have an interesting conversation that we're going to have today because I'm here as the Executive Director of 4SA, Michael Swain, speaking to our Head of Legal, Mrs. Liesl Pretorius. And we're talking about local and international developments in radical gender politics. Now, recently, to give a little bit of background, the Western Cape Department of Health and Wellness published a position statement on what they call evidence-based care for transgender and gender-diverse people. And this has provoked a strong reaction within the medical community. And also in both the USA and the UK, while radical gender politics seem to be pushing unabated in some areas, in others, the tide does seem to be turning, or at least slowing down. And increasingly, even government institutions are questioning whether the impact of what is a radical gender ideology and medical treatments on children is a positive. Now, just to put this in context, the reason why we're obviously talking about this is because this is very much at the core of a couple of key issues that we've been dealing with. The one, of course, is parental rights. We've been dealing with the ECE, or Early Childhood Education Toolkit, which is designed to train teachers to create a culture of effectively transgenderism in pre-primary and primary schools, which we and many others in the coalition of senior religious leaders representing some 20 million people are pushing back against and saying this is not education, this is a type of indoctrination. And of course, the other area where this comes into play is that recently the president signed, although it is not yet implemented, the Hate Speech Act. And one of the protected categories, or some of the protected categories, are things like gender, gender expression, sexual orientation, sex. All these words, the meaning is now extremely difficult to actually pin down. And partly that's because of this transgender debate and this ideology. So we need to talk about this because obviously people need to understand what this is about, what the trends are. We're not talking about medical issues or expertise because we don't have any of that in 4SA, but it is very important to those in our core constituency, parents, teachers, religious leaders, and so on. I think it's probably also worth starting off by saying that there are obviously children who suffer from gender dysphoria, and that is a very tormenting thing for a child, to actually believe that you are somehow trapped in the wrong body. You feel like a boy, even though you're biologically and in every other way a girl, or vice versa. But it should be said that that is a very rare condition. And typically and historically, those children who've suffered from that type of dysphoria have actually, let's say, corrected or self-corrected as a consequence of the natural process of going through puberty, when obviously your secondary sexual characteristics manifest. It may be at that point, of course, that if you are, let's say, a young woman, but you feel very strongly that you should be a boy, you may then be same-sex attracted. And obviously the opposite would apply with a man who thinks he's a woman. But that does not in any way mean that you are actually some form of third sex. So this has been the big area of dispute and contention. And so, Liesl, let me just ask you then, we've mentioned the circular or position statement that has been put out by the Western Cape Department of Health and Wellness. Tell us a little bit more about this, and particularly why is this so controversial, and what has the response been, if any, of the medical community in the Western Cape?
Thank you, Michael. Yes, what you are mentioning is the position statement concerning evidence-based care for transgender and gender-diverse people. This position statement was uncovered by a group of doctors and medical professionals, some of them linked to an organization called First Do No Harm South Africa. Now, their primary concern, their primary issue with this position statement is that it's not properly researched and it is not based on sound medical evidence. They say that this position statement uses terms as medical truth or accepted fact when they are indeed not, when they are indeed highly contentious terms and not based on sound medical evidence. So they came to the conclusion, or in their view, this position statement is clearly and ideologically founded document, not a medically founded document, especially, they say, since there is nothing in the document that mentions the highest, most recent quality evidence on the care of dysphoric children. This is, of course, the CAS review that was published in the United Kingdom. Their primary concern is harm to children. They say that there's no evidence that these suggested treatments for children with gender dysphoria are beneficial to children, and for this reason alone, it should not be practiced on children. And then also, and in addition to that, the current best practice medical evidence shows there's zero benefit from giving puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to children and adolescents, and it may even lead to detrimental, even devastating long-term consequences. So no benefit and detrimental consequences, according to this group. Now, and it is worth noting that following the publication of the CAS report in the United Kingdom, puberty blockers were banned in the United Kingdom, and no hormones may be given to adolescents under the age of 18 years. The only exception it would be under a clinical trial with the necessary ethical oversight. And it's not even a certainty that permission would be given under those circumstances. And another thing worth mentioning is we have picked up in news reports that there are certain criticisms against the CAS review by the so-called Yale Integrity Report, and we questioned the standing of this criticism against the CAS review with a medical professional associated with First Do No Harm. And the person told us that this Yale Integrity Report is not even a peer-reviewed publication, and it has already been debunked by a very recent article published in the British Medical Journal. So it seems that the CAS report and its recommendations stand firm. But Michael, could you tell us more about the CAS report?
Yes, I mean, to give a little background, some few years ago, and it's interesting that South Africa seems to be obviously, and I think very fortunately, lagging behind the rest of the world in this whole push towards transgenderism and these different medical interventions. In the UK, there was a big scandal some few years back now, because a clinic that was set up specifically to deal with the whole gender issue, called the Tavistock Clinic, was embroiled in a scandal because it emerged that in many cases, the children who had actually been taken to this clinic actually were also suffering from quite serious levels of autism. And not only that, but there was almost zero counseling that was given to these children, alternative to straight into the gender affirmation, puberty blockers, cross-hormone therapies, and ultimately, of course, gender transition surgery, which is essentially mutilation. It's the cutting off of breasts in women and the reconstruction of genitalia and that type of thing. So very, very serious medical interventions. And there's now one of the largest class action lawsuits that is taking place. And this is a trend that, by the way, is likely to be seen increasingly, because many of these children, of course, as they start to grow older, they realize that they are now left with the consequences. So the CAS report was the government's way of actually saying, let's have a thorough investigation into this. And the report is, by all accounts, an excellent report. And it basically reveals that there is actually no significant, or if any, like there's zero benefit of actually pushing children down this medical interventionist route. And that is why, obviously, there's been a pullback on behalf of the UK government in particularly on the prescription of puberty blockers and so on and so forth. And also, of course, why the transgender activists are very, very upset, because clearly this undercuts a lot of what they have been trying to push with their narrative. So these are the Western Cape. I mean, they've come out with this report, which speaks about evidence-based. Tell us, what's the next steps? What's happening now as a consequence of the comments and the input that they've received?
Well, after this position statement was circulated, and there was a backlash and an outcry from the medical community in the Western Cape, members of the medical community very recently had a meeting with the Western Department of Health and Wellness. And during this meeting, the department confirmed that they received a large number of comments. They also confirmed that the circular, which contains the position statement, has been withdrawn, and that persons who are interested in this matter and who want to comment on it have until the end of January to make submissions. That we're also aware that the circular has been circulated through the health department, also to rural areas, also to get comments from all stakeholders. Just two concerning things. First of all, we're glad to hear that it has been retracted, and there's now this opportunity for proper comment from all relevant stakeholders. But two things that are concerning, and I think that should be mentioned, is that firstly, it was withdrawn, but it was not withdrawn with a formal announcement. Apparently it just disappeared from the department's website. There's nothing on the website that says this document has now been withdrawn, which can create the situation where you have medical practitioners out there who think that this document is still current. And the other concern, of course, and this was also voiced by some members of the medical community, is why was this document only withdrawn, and then there's this extended public consultation process now after it was first published? Shouldn't there have been public consultation first before a document of this nature is withdrawn?
Yes, and definitely that's often the problem with public participation. We've seen this in other areas too, that it really ought to take place, but actually doesn't. It's almost like you're presented with a fait accompli. But just to switch continents, in the New York Post, there was a recent article, because it looks as well as if in the USA, this has also reached some kind of a tipping point. The US Supreme Court is now poised and ready to rule on the constitutionality of the state of Tennessee's ban on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to treat gender-related distress in minors. And obviously some other states have also followed this route as well. And of course, the court, when it rules, it will be then binding on all states. So whatever position a state may have taken, obviously will be impacted by what the Supreme Court of Appeal rules. So maybe, Liesl, you could tell us, has the approach of the medical community in the USA, so-called transgender affirming treatment, how's this been affected by this tide of gender litigation, so to speak, and also the increasing number of detransitioners? Maybe you could just shed some light on that for us.
Yes, certainly, Michael. So this very recent post by the New York Post reports that in the US, the ban on prescribing these so-called gender-affirming treatments to minors is tightening, which means that these medical treatments for minors with gender dysphoria will be less available. This US Supreme Court is set to start hearing the Tennessee case in December, because Tennessee is one of many states that have banned puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors. And according to American legal experts, they believe that Tennessee will win its case. In other words, that this ban for minors, we're talking about minors, not adults, minors, will be constitutional. And this could potentially mean the end or a great reduction in pediatric transgender care in about 24 states. And there has already been an impact on the medical community, even in so-called blue or democratic voting states. Access to this type of treatment could be greatly reduced, but they've already seen that in some of these blue states, prescriptions have been declining, and in some cases very sharply. Detransitioners, there's a rising tide of persons who are detransitioning, and some are taking the institutions that promoted these medical interventions to them to court to say that this is actually medical malpractice, or that they were not actually given informed consent. They were not told about the incredible negative consequences, long-term negative consequences of this treatment, what it would have and how it would impact their lives. And as one expert mentions, they believe that there will become a time of reckoning where the account will have to be given for all the misery that these treatments, or just prescribing them without due caution, has caused to many people, and that this will likely in the next 5 to 10 years see a wave of litigation. But that's the legal side, Michael. Like I mentioned, the research, more and more research is coming out questioning the impact of this treatment, and especially long-term effect. Could you perhaps tell us about this research and the claims about the increased suicide risk if parents don't affirm their children and don't immediately support their children? There are even concerns also raised in this article about this treatment of minors and the approach by some clinicians and some lobby groups and some medical institutions that support this so-called gender-affirming care, that the concern is that they do not actually have the best interest of the patient at heart.
Yeah, it is really quite a terrible thing. And again, thank God this research is now revealing these things. The fact that we're now able to see with something of a dreadful view of hindsight just the impact that this is having. And increasingly, what the view is that the first treatment for minors who are experiencing some type of gender dysphoria should actually be therapy and speaking and counseling, not to rush in to some intervention. One of the problems is, of course, that even affirming a child who has this level of confusion starts to lock in the condition. So to say to a little boy or a little girl, we're now going to use your preferred name, and we're going to, which they have done overseas, literally give you clothes so you can dress up in the gender that you now have decided that you're going to be. We're going to call you by your preferred name. That actually starts to lock in the condition. And of course, parents are also, in a real way, was terrified to go against this push, because there are many, I think, my personal opinion, disingenuous psychiatrists who basically give almost parents the binary. Would you like to have a living daughter or a dead son in the event that the boy wants to actually become a girl, and so on and so forth. So it really is very problematic. And of course, once you have these medical interventions, they are irreversible. Effectively, it's a form of chemical castration for boys who go on to gender-affirming therapies and cross-hormone therapies. And of course, what happens, and what is increasingly becoming clear, is that when children actually grow up and they grow older, suddenly they realize the lifetime consequences that they're now forced to live with, that perhaps they can never have children. These treatments are literally experimental. The instances of cancer increasing, the skeletal, literally sort of collapse that is also a consequence. The fact that where you've had perhaps some form of implant or something, you're left with lifetime medical complications that you were probably never aware of when it actually happened. And again, it is such an ideological push, and there's been a lot of discrediting, which I think is also a very good thing, of these, let's say, ideological interests. So, for example, one of the leading authorities on this whole area are called the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, as they were called. And it's recently come to light that actually, far from being medically based, many of the people who were in the key decision-making areas of this organization, who, by the way, also advised the WHO, and the WHO basically took it on board, lock, stock, and barrel. They turn out to just be nothing more than activists. And there's even now evidence is coming forth from the Biden administration actually trying to get WPATH to actually review transgender guidelines to drop the age limits. This came from the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services under the Biden administration, called Admiral Rachel Levine, who actually is a transgender man. And this has fundamentally now discredited WPATH's influence. And again, much of this, in America's a very litigious context, is highly likely to come back to, the chickens will come back to roost in the form of massive lawsuits. So people are really starting to consider and to say, wait a minute, and even a respected child psychologist who focuses on the treatment of people who identify as transgender and who is not opposed in principle from their experience of some form of treatment, reckons that this ban on treatment may be difficult for children, but it certainly won't lead to a wave of suicides, and children will come to cope with the reality. And of course, that's really the essence of it. We're talking about children here. If you're an adult, once you hit the adulthood, age of 18, then do what you want to do, live how you want to live, love who you want to love. But to actually start to prescribe and even to push this agenda into children is obviously very deeply concerning. And again, back to the UK, which is maybe a good place to just wrap up this interview. The UK government, and this is where we're seeing these trends now changing, I think, for the better, has recently thanked the Christian Institute, which is a UK-based organization, who raised this important matter to protect children from radical gender ideology in schools. And that's what we're also pushing back against in South Africa. So maybe these will just finish us off by telling us a little bit what's happening in the UK and what is the government's response there now.
Yes, certainly, Michael. And before I do that, we just want to reiterate that obviously we recognize the inherent human dignity and equality of all people, but we're talking about children here. I mean, now we're going to talk about the UK and schools. The best interest of the child principle is a central principle in our constitution, and enshrined principle. It's a massive principle in international law. And the question is, we need the medical evidence and medical facts, the base medical evidence, to consider the lifelong impact of these treatments on children who are gender dysphoric, and any person, however they identify or don't identify, needs to be treated with compassion and care, but especially these children, because there will be long-term consequences. So that's the reason for caution. We don't want to see any person harmed or unnecessarily suffering. As you say, once you hit adulthood and you decide this is the path you want to go, you're an adult, you have that choice. But back to the United Kingdom. So the Christian Institute, they handed a letter signed by over 100 teachers and governors, etc., people in the education sector, to the British Minister of Education. And in this letter, they questioned the government's draft guidelines on relationship, sex, and health education, and the guidelines on gender questioning children. And their concern is primarily that teaching materials are ideologically driven, and I don't want to see this in schools. Now, the response to this has been very positive, and the Christian Institute says it is delighted that the draft policies, they're still drafts, but that even in the draft forms, these policies now prohibit a school from having a blanket policy on automatically supporting children who question their gender identity to socially transition, because the Institute says that this area has been dominated by activists for far too long. So they want a more reasonable or balanced approach. And they also welcome the more cautious approach, obviously following the suggestions and the recommendations of the CAS review, that the draft guideline will prohibit schools from promoting transgender ideology. And it also restricts primary schools from giving any explicit teaching about sexual activity, except in exceptional circumstances. So the government has, already the draft guidelines are more conservative. It shows the British government is taking the CAS review seriously. And the government has also said that they will consult with all stakeholders, and they've emphasized that the well-being of children is the most important consideration. And that's what we have also been saying in this interview. It's not about not recognizing the inherent human dignity or equality of any person. We absolutely do that. But it is about the well-being of children and making sure that children are not rushed into something or given a treatment that 10 years from now, but it seems the evidence is coming in even now, but 10 years from now down the line, they're living with consequences of bad decisions due to treatments based not on the best medical evidence, for example. So I think it's news from the UK that the CAS review is being taken seriously.
Good. Let's hope that our government takes the same enlightened view. But I think we're out of time this week. I trust that you found this an interesting conversation, an interesting update for you. And please do follow us. We obviously have a YouTube channel. By the way, you can click the subscribe and the like buttons on this video. And please forward it to people who you think might find it helpful. Also, follow us on Facebook. We are Freedom of Religion SA on Facebook, and of course our YouTube channel we've mentioned. Our website is forsa.org.za. That's constantly updated too. So stay informed, stay up to date. But thank you so much for watching, and please do support us financially. FORSA is dependent upon voluntary contributions. So if you value the work that we do, then please do add value in turn to us. So until the next time, we wish you very well. God bless.
Good day. This is Nobukosi Zulu, legal advisor at FORSA. Remember to like and share this video and then click on the subscribe button to make sure you never miss our video updates on vital religious freedom issues.